So before we turn our attention to the recycling or reworking of red blood cells after their 100 to 120 day life cycle, let's just review erythropoiesis. Erythro is red, poiesis is formation. So that's the formation of red blood cells that occurs in the red bone marrow. So that process occurs because the kidneys detect hypoxia or hypoxemia, which would be deficient oxygen in the tissues or deficient oxygen in the bloodstream. That forces the kidneys to release erythropoietin, which stimulates erythropoiesis in the red bone marrow. Now, the kidneys are also going to release renin, which will help regulate blood pressure, increase blood pressure, but let's just consider erythropoietin in the process of red blood cell formation. So once the kidneys release erythropoietin, that erythropoietin targets the red bone marrow in the proximal epiphyses of the humerus and the femurs and some of the flat bones. That, over the 15-day process from hemocytoblast to reticulocyte to mature red blood cell or erythrocyte, takes about 15 days. So let's now look at how those red blood cells that have reached the end of their life cycle are just not functioning as well as they could or should, how they're recycled. So that occurs because those red blood cells are phagocytized by macrophages. Those are derivatives of white blood cells called monocytes, and that occurs in the spleen, the liver, and the bone marrow. So the first thing that happens is the hemoglobin is broken down. The globin portion, that's the alpha and beta chains, 2 alpha, 2 beta chains, are catabolized into their amino acids. Those amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, are then put out into the bloodstream and can be used to make more red blood cells, or they could be used simply to make other components of the body. So part of the recipe for making a red blood cell is amino acids and proteins that'll be used to make hemoglobin or to make protein channels or protein receptors in the red blood cells. And the heme portion takes a little more work to recycle and reuse. So the heme portion, the iron-containing portion of your hemoglobin, is converted to a chemical called bilirubin. That's a yellowish pigment, and that pigment is picked up by the liver and processed in a couple of different ways. One of those is the creation of urobilinogen, which may be excreted through fecal material through processing in the kidneys. It's what gives your urine that yellowish color. Or it can be converted in the intestines to stercobilinin and then excreted as part of feces or fecal material, which also gives feces a somewhat yellowish sheen to it. Now there's another pathway for heme's recycling, and that is that the iron part of heme can be stored as ferritin or hemosiderin in the liver, and then it can be bound to a protein in a molecule called transferrin. The trans meaning to transfer, ferrin refers to iron, Fe being the chemical symbol for iron, and then that can be transferred in the plasma to red bone marrow where it's used for erythropoiesis. Now, if we go back to what we need to make our red blood cell, we need to consider proteins, amino acids that are used to build the cell membrane and used to build hemoglobin, iron that's used to build hemoglobin, vitamin B12 and folic acid, which is vitamin B9, that are used to manufacture the DNA that's in the nucleus of the red blood cell, phospholipids that are required to make the membrane of the red blood cell, ATP that's required for building of the cell, glucose or glycogen that we need to oxidize into ATP for energy to make our red blood cell. So if you need some help for question 7 in the previous video, here's some of that help in the last few seconds where we've talked about the recipe for a red blood cell. So let's consider some disorders of the erythrocytes or red blood cells. And one broad category is the anemias. And anemias, other than sickle cell anemia, are usually a symptom, an outward manifestation of a bigger problem or an underlying problem. And in general, anemias are usually caused by hemorrhage, that's a loss of blood and thus a loss of red blood cells, decreased erythropoiesis, or decreased hemoglobin production, or a high rate of red blood cell destruction. So let's first consider hemorrhagic anemia. Hemorrhagic anemia, as in hemorrhage, occurs because of a loss of blood. So that's a decreased amount of red blood cells due to a loss of blood. It could also be due to bleeding disorders or platelet disorders that might occur as well. Iron deficiency anemia, which you can see here, is due to a lack of iron. And most women become iron deficient anemic at some point during their reproductive years, some point every month during their reproductive years. And as you can see here, the person with iron deficiency anemia doesn't make enough hemoglobin. So their hemoglobinometer results would be lower than normal, lower than the 12 to 18 that we'd normally expect. You can also see here that the red blood cells are what we generally call people anemic looking. They're a little bit small, they're quite pale because they're not binding enough oxygen. And what we'd see with this patient on the outside is fatigue in general. Fatigue due to a lack of oxygen transport, which means lesser aerobic respiration, lesser ATP. So our ATP needs aren't able to be satisfied by the raw products that we have in the bloodstream. You can also see here pernicious anemia, and pernicious means dangerous. So this type of anemia is caused by a lack of vitamin B12 in the diet. That's something that you'd be likely to see with vegans or vegetarians because the best sources of B12 are red meats. So here we see that the red blood cells, and if you look at the arrow here, become macrocytic, meaning much too large, macros large, to fit through the capillaries where exchange of nutrients takes place. And those capillaries are only one red blood cell wide. Some other causes of pernicious anemia might be damage to the intestines, which need to secrete something called intrinsic factor that aids in the absorption of vitamin B12. On the right-hand side here, we see aplastic anemia, where the A means not and plastic refers to formation. So this is a decreased number of functional red blood cells due to a lack of formation. And if you look in the blood sample here, you can see there, over there, several places where these red blood cells don't look normal. Now, certainly this person will produce some that are normal, but not enough to support life or be compatible with life. This is usually due to a problem with the red bone marrow itself, and generally requires a bone marrow transplant. Another type of anemia are hemolytic anemias. Hemo is blood, lytic is bursting, so that refers to bursting of the red blood cells before it's their time, before they've reached the end of their lifespan. And this can occur from transfusion, which will cause, or incompatible transfusion, which would cause agglutination of antibodies in the incompatible blood and red blood cells in the recipient, or from the Ebola virus, which causes rupture of the red blood cells. Another type of anemia is thalassemia that tends to occur in Mediterranean ancestry peoples, so those that would live around the Mediterranean in southern Italy, in some of the northern African nations, the Greek, those that live in Cyprus. And what this particular disorder produces is due to a genetic mutation, they produce a lack of one of the beta chains in hemoglobin, or a faulty chain, or it can occur in the alpha chains as well. It varies in severity, but what you can see in the picture here is the red blood cells that look quite pale. They don't bind hemoglobin well. They're not well shaped, so they don't produce or carry as much oxygen as is required. And here you're seeing a representation of sickle cell anemia, which is another of the genetic disorders with blood cells. And in this case, there's a problem with one of the beta globin chains. So when those beta globin chains are present, they produce this sickle-shaped or oddly shaped hemoglobin that causes sickling of the red blood cells. And as you see in the center part, that sickling means that unlike normal red blood cells, the sickle cells will clump on each other and cause occlusion of that vessel. And here, another view of a sample of sickle cell anemia for a person. You can see the sickled cell here and here, but also note that not all of the cells are sickled. And then lastly, there is malaria, which is a parasitic infection that tends to occur in tropical regions. It's transmitted by an Anopheles mosquito, and that mosquito effectively uses your red blood cells as nurseries, as uteruses, if you will, to make more of their own parasites. Once the parasites are ready to be released into the bloodstream, they rupture, and that transmits more of the parasite throughout the body. So question number 8 is to describe the process of red blood cell recycling from the point at which the red blood cell is engulfed by a macrophage in the spleen, liver, or bone marrow to recycling the final end products.